Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, pouring your coffee, turning on the news, and discovering that the fundamental law of gravity, like the literal thing keeping your feet firmly attached to the floor, has actually been a complete illusion this whole time.
Oh, man.
Right. And not only that, but the Earth is actually accelerating upward. And the entire architecture of the universe, as you understand it, is just a mathematical error. Everything you based your sense of security on just completely dissolved.
I mean, it would be terrifying. It would be a total psychological freefall. You wouldn't just question science, right? You would question your own sanity, your place in the
Yes,
universe.
religion. Yeah.
Exactly. Probably all before lunch, you know?
Yeah. And that feeling of complete and utter existential vertigo is exactly where we are dropping in today. So welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a stack of incredibly dense, but honestly fascinating academic course materials focused on the 17th century in England. Specifically, we're looking at the poetry of this era,
Yeah.
right before the Restoration.
Yeah.
And our mission here, for you listening, whether you're studying for an exam or just love history, is to understand how the human mind processes the literal collapse of reality, and how that trauma gave birth to some of the most complex, brilliant, and honestly bizarre literature ever written. I'm talking about the metaphysical movement, along with the Cavaliers, the Spenserians, and the early Augustans.
It's just a remarkable period to study because usually when we look back at history, we crave a linear narrative, right? We want to see one generation carefully laying the bricks for the next.
Yeah, nice, neat timeline.
Exactly. But the 17th century is not a brick wall. It's an earthquake. If we want to understand the writers who lived through it, like John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, we first have to strip away our modern comfort and really look at the chaotic world that forged them.
Well, I want to start right there with the earthquake. The source materials describe the collapse of the Elizabethan order, the late 1500s into the 1600s. And the backdrop to all of this is the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. Now, I know Britain wasn't the main battlefield for that specific conflict, but this was a massive, bloody struggle across Europe, pitting Catholics against Protestants.
Right.
We are talking about whole populations being decimated.
The physical devastation on the continent was staggering, yes, but the ideological devastation is what really crept across the English Channel. You have to remember, for centuries, Europe had operated on a medieval worldview that was entirely unified. It was a closed system based on faith, a divine hierarchy, and a very specific cosmic architecture.
A system where everyone knew their place.
Exactly. The Catholic Church had provided a singular truth. Now you have this incredibly violent schism. People are literally slaughtering each other over the nature of salvation. So that unified worldview is fracturing into a million sharp pieces.
And it wasn't just a crisis of faith, though, right? It was a crisis of physical reality. The materials talk about the astronomical revolution literally dismantling the universe.
Quite literally dismantling it. Let's look at the Ptolemaic view of the universe, which had been the accepted truth for, over a millennium.
That's the Earth-centric model, right?
Yes, but it's more than just geography, it's theology. In the Ptolemaic system, the Earth is fixed, it's unmoving, right in the center of the universe. Surrounding the Earth are these perfect, concentric, crystalline spheres containing the moon, the sun, the planets, and the stars.
Okay.
And beyond that outermost sphere is the prime mover, God. It is an incredibly cozy, reassuring system. Humanity sits in the center of a divine theater, being watched over by a creator who is just on the other side of the ceiling.
So if I'm understanding this, every time you look up at the night sky in, say, 1550, you aren't just seeing stars, you're seeing the literal floorboards of heaven.
Precisely. It is religiously sanctioned astronomy. But then, and here's the earthquake, you have the rise of empirical science. Copernicus proposes a heliocentric model, placing the sun at the center. Kepler calculates planetary motion. Galileo points a telescope at the moon and sees that it isn't a perfect, smooth, crystalline sphere at all.
It's bumpy.
Right. It's covered in jagged mountains and craters. It's imperfect.
I cannot even fathom the shock of that. It's one thing to hear a rumor that the sun is the center of the solar system. It is another thing entirely to look through a glass tube and see with your own physical eyes that the heavenly bodies are just rocks.
John Donne, who we will spend a lot of time with later, famously wrote a line capturing this exact panic. He said, "A new philosophy calls all in doubt."
Wow.
By new philosophy, he meant this new science. It was shrinking the territory of blind faith and replacing it with observation and mathematics. The universe was no longer a cozy, finite room designed for humanity. It was becoming an infinite, cold, mechanical void.
Okay, let's unpack this. If I'm an artist or a poet living through this, if my religious institutions are tearing each other apart in bloody wars, and my scientific understanding of the very ground I walk on is suddenly proven false, how on earth do I cope with that? How does art respond when reality fundamentally breaks?
Well, it creates a massive schism in the human psyche. Think about the era just before this, the Renaissance. The Renaissance had been defined by this incredible buoyancy, this optimistic self-confidence in human potential. Man was the measure of all things.
Very humanistic.
Yes. But as this new science clashes with old ethics and as political violence erupts, that Renaissance optimism curdles. It turns into deep pessimism, tension, and chaos. And in the 17th century, we see the aesthetic response to this trauma branch into two very distinct artistic movements, Mannerism and the Baroque.
Let's look at mannerism first. The sources define it as the excessive use of a distinctive trait. But what does that actually look like in practice? Because when I think of excessive traits, I think of like a caricature.
That's actually a really helpful way to think about it. In literature, mannerism happens when a poet takes a specific intellectual tool, usually an ingenious analogy or a witty comparison, and pushes it so incredibly far that the poetry almost breaks under the weight of it.
So just showing off.
Basically, it is the sheer love of ingenuity for its own sake. It's an intellectual game used as a defense mechanism against the chaos.
The course materials point to a poet named John Cleveland as the poster child for this.
Yes, Cleveland was incredibly popular in his day, actually far more popular than Milton at the time. He makes wit into an extreme sport. But later critics, most notably Samuel Johnson, looked back at Cleveland and argued that his poetry was completely unbalanced. It was overly analytical.
What does that mean, overly analytical, in this context?
It means he was brilliant at pulling things apart, at finding bizarre connections between totally unrelated objects, but he lacked the poetic power to synthesize those things back together into a meaningful emotional truth. The imaginative pressure just wasn't there. He's just showing you how clever he is.
So it's all scaffolding and no building. It's a parlor trick. You look at it, you say, wow, that's a clever way to compare a politician to a piece of fruit. But it doesn't move you to tears or change your perspective on life.
Exactly. Now, on the total opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Baroque. If mannerism is a retreat into cold intellectual excess, the Baroque is a total surrender to the crisis of sensibility. It is highly emotional, deeply tense, and sometimes bordering on the macabre.
It's basically screaming into the void, but making it look beautiful.
That is a very apt description. The Baroque is trying to force a reconciliation between the vibrant physical energy of the Renaissance and the strict spiritual demands of medieval ethics. And the primary poet the sources highlight here is Richard Crashaw.
Right, Crashaw. The materials mention that he merges incredibly sensuous, almost shocking physical images with this intense religious fervor.
Crashaw's sensibility is utterly fascinating. He takes the raw experience of human suffering and subjects it to a glittering metamorphosis. He wants to overwhelm your senses to the point where you break through into the divine. A perfect example is his poem The Weeper, which is an extended meditation on Mary Magdalene crying tears of repentance.
Repentance usually sounds somber, but the imagery he uses here is wild.
It is entirely unrestrained. He describes her weeping eyes as nests of milky doves, and then, famously, he describes her tears as portable and compendious oceans.
Portable oceans. That is such a jarring combination of words. An ocean is vast and untamable, and portable sounds like a piece of luggage.
Right. And he doesn't stop there. He portrays drops of Christ's blood as rubies. It's a very continental European-style, lush, rich, sensuous, ecstatic. He is trying to conjure up a resplendent, jeweled world of tenderness and joy as a direct countermeasure against the ugly, horrifying reality of a world that is fundamentally out of joint. If reality is a war-torn, mechanical void, Crashaw's response is to build a blindingly beautiful, emotional cathedral out of words.
Okay, so if the world is ending, you can either play complex intellectual word games like the Mannerists, or you can have an ecstatic emotional breakdown like the Baroque writers. But I know that wasn't everyone. Before we get to the giants of the metaphysical era, there were other groups trying to survive this century, right? The poetic landscape wasn't just a binary choice.
Far from it. If we want a true map of this era, we have to look at the other major voices: the Spenserians, the Cavaliers, and the early Augustans. Studying them is crucial for this deep dive because they each offer a completely different coping mechanism for this cultural chaos.
Let's start with the Spenserians. The materials call them the living link between Edmund Spenser, who wrote during the golden age of Queen Elizabeth, and John Milton, who comes later. We are talking about poets like Phineas and Giles Fletcher, George Wither, and William Browne.
What is most revealing about the Spenserians is what they chose not to do. While the world was fracturing and writers like Donne were inventing a jagged, argumentative new style to match that fracture, the Spenserians largely ignored it.
Wait, they just ignored it?
Pretty much. They retreated, they stuck to the old Elizabethan ways. They wrote pastoral poetry poems about shepherds in green fields. They wrote elaborate allegories. Their work was solemn, serious, and entirely focused on the exaltation of traditional virtue.
So while the 30 Years' War is raging and Galileo is dismantling the cosmos, these guys are writing high fantasy about nymphs and shepherds. It sounds like total denial.
It was a form of preservation. They believed they were guarding a sacred, continuous legacy of English literature. George Wither, for instance, is a fascinating case. He had a very strong Puritan strain. He wrote extensively about the English countryside and believed deeply in the healing, moral power of nature. In a way, he anticipates the Romantic poets who would arrive over a century later.
But I'm guessing he wasn't just writing about pretty trees.
No, he couldn't resist moralizing. He would insert heavy, didactic moral maxims into these gentle pastoral scenes, which created a very strange rhythm. It interrupted the natural flow of the poetry. But regardless of their quirks, the Spenserians were essential because they kept that grand allegorical tradition alive. They carried the torch so that it was still burning when John Milton was ready to write Paradise Lost.
That makes sense. They were the archivists. But if the Spenserians were the solemn archivists hiding in the countryside, the next group was practically throwing a party on the deck of the Titanic. My personal favorites to read about: the Cavalier poets.
Ah, yes, the tribe of Ben.
Yes, these were the fiercely loyal, royalist supporters of King Charles I. And instead of retreating into allegory, they looked back to the classical world, ancient Rome and Greece. They wanted to model themselves on the discipline, the poise, and the highly civilized grace of the playwright Ben Jonson.
The Cavaliers represent a very specific, upper-class, aristocratic response to chaos. They sought a synthesis of Johnsonian classical grace with just a hint of the analytical wit we see in the Metaphysicals. But they are distinct from both. Their primary focus was on the center of emotion, but keeping that emotion critically controlled. They valued elegance above all. And Robert Herrick is undeniably the master of this group.
Herrick is the patron saint of Carpe Diem. Seize the day.
Gather ye rosebuds while ye may.
Exactly. When you read Herrick, it feels like this romantic, joyous celebration of life. In the poem highlighted in the sources, Corinna's Going A-Maying, he's basically standing outside his lover's window, telling her to get out of bed, put on her clothes, and come celebrate the spring festival.
It is a vibrant celebration of paganism and the indissoluble bond between humanity and the rhythms of nature. Herrick actually argues in the poem that to stay in bed, to ignore the beauteous rhythm of the spring, is an act of literal impiety. Nature is a religion to him, and youth is its sacrament.
But it's not just blind, happy-go-lucky optimism, is it? Because in another poem mentioned to Dianeme, he shows this stark, almost brutal realism. He's talking to his beautiful, proud lover, but instead of just praising her, he tells her not to be too arrogant. He reminds her that eventually her beauty will decay. She has no armor against time.
That is the shadow hanging over all Cavalier poetry, the awareness of transience, the inescapable law of change and death. When Herrick says, gather ye rosebuds, he isn't just saying have fun, he's saying we are all going to die and the world is falling apart, so we must violently snatch whatever joy we can right now.
It is a very sobering, dark reality check, hidden inside a perfectly graceful musical lyric.
And as we move through the rest of the Cavaliers, that grace starts to fracture a bit. You have Thomas Carew, Sir John Suckling, and Richard Lovelace. Carew seems to maintain that Johnsonian control. The notes describe him as having an urbane intellectual polish. He analyzes love with a dry, almost clinical precision. Carew is the diplomat of the group. But Suckling and Lovelace show us what happens when that aristocratic composure starts to crack under the pressure of the era. Suckling is much more cynical and volatile.
Yeah, his poem Song is hilarious but kind of unhinged. He's trying to woo this pale, mute woman. Yes, why so pale and wan, fond lover? And when she doesn't respond to his poetry or his charm, he just completely loses his cool. He drops the romantic act entirely and basically curses her, saying, "The devil take her."
It completely lacks the emotional discipline that Ben Jonson advocated. Suckling slips into a boisterous tavern brawl tone, and Richard Lovelace takes that even further into an area of casual vulgarity.
Mhm.
In his poem, The Scrutiny, he explores this toxic fickleness. He vows to a woman that he will be constant, but the very next morning, he revokes his pledge without a second thought.
He just abandons her.
With zero moral qualms. It perfectly reflects a very cavalier, if you'll pardon the pun, attitude toward ethical commitments. It reveals a society that, deep down, feels untethered from any lasting moral anchor. If the world might end tomorrow, why honor a promise today?
So the Cavaliers are drinking, loving, and laughing through the apocalypse. But clearly, a society cannot function like that forever. You can't just have everyone abandoning morals and acting like boisterous cynics. Didn't anyone try to pump the brakes and restore some order?
They absolutely did, and that brings us to the third group in our landscape, the early Augustans. As the 17th century progressed, especially into the middle decades, society was completely exhausted. They were tired of the ideological wars, the bloodshed of the English Civil War, and the theological debates that tore families apart.
They just wanted the ground to stop shaking.
Exactly. And this craving for stability coincided with the rise of the Royal Society and the philosophy of thinkers like Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes. There was a desperate desire for order, decorum, and strict reason. The intense emotional turbulence of the Baroque, the wild intellect of the Mannerists, and the cynical boisterousness of the Cavaliers all started to feel dangerous. They felt like symptoms of the disease that was destroying the country.
So how did the Augustans try to cure it through poetry?
By shifting the focus, poetry moved away from mapping the inner, passionate, erratic vibrations of the individual soul, and instead focused on the social, rational, and public aspects of humanity. Edmund Waller and Sir John Denham are the true pioneers here.
The sources credit Waller with reforming the poetic numbers. That sounds very mathematical. He introduced the tight, balanced, heroic couplet. Why does a specific rhyme scheme matter so much to a traumatized society? How does a heroic couplet work?
It's a brilliant psychological tool. A heroic couplet consists of 2 consecutive lines of poetry, usually in iambic pentameter, that rhyme, A, A, B, B. But more importantly, the thought is usually contained entirely within those 2 lines. It doesn't spill over. It is closed, balanced, symmetrical.
I see. So instead of a thought rambling on chaotically for 10 lines, it's boxed in.
Exactly. You can see this in Waller's poem of the last verses. He uses the couplet to keep emotional exuberance strictly in check. It favors polite rationality over raw emotion. Reading a heroic couplet feels like walking through a perfectly manicured hedge maze rather than a wild, terrifying forest. It gave the reader a sense of control.
And Denham took that sense of control and applied it to physical spaces. He pioneered something called local poetry with his poem Cooper's Hill.
Yes, Denham would look at a specific landscape and blend highly descriptive physical details of the geography with calm, measured historical reflection. It wasn't about his personal emotional crisis. It was about stepping back, looking at the land, and finding a rational perspective. It is deliberate, calm, and soothing.
The materials also mention Abraham Cowley here as a transition figure.
Cowley is fascinating because he bridges the gap. He started out using the incredibly complex, twisting conceits of the metaphysical poets, but he was also one of the founding members of the Royal Society. Over time, he pushed for scientific clarity and mathematical plainness in language. He wanted to strip away the confusion of metaphor and arrive at clear, agreeable truths. He is the bridge from the chaotic early 1600s to the rational enlightenment that was coming.
Okay, let me make sure I have this all straight. We have the Spenserians writing nostalgic allegories about shepherds to ignore the chaos. We have the Cavaliers throwing a hyper-literate cynical party to distract themselves from the chaos. And we have the Augustans trying to build mathematical rational boxes to contain the chaos.
That is an excellent summary of the landscape.
But now we turn to the writers who didn't ignore it, didn't distract themselves, and didn't try to box it in. We turn to the Metaphysicals, the writers who stared directly into the void of the 17th century and tried to forge a brand new unity out of the broken pieces. And we have to start with the maverick who completely blew up the rulebook, John Donne.
John Donne is an absolute towering figure in English literature, and to truly understand why his poetry sounds the way it does, you have to understand the man and the myth. His life was a study in extreme dualities, brilliant potential, followed by devastating, crushing setbacks.
The first huge setback was something he had no control over. He was born into a very prominent Catholic family in an England that was militantly Protestant.
That fact alone defined his early life. Being a known Catholic in Elizabethan England wasn't just socially awkward, it was incredibly dangerous. It was tantamount to treason. It barred him from taking a degree at Oxford or Cambridge, which effectively locked him out of the standard, secure paths to power and influence in the government.
But despite that massive handicap, he actually manages to climb a ladder anyway. He secures this incredibly promising position as the chief secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton, the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. He's essentially sitting at the right hand of power.
He was on the verge of a magnificent secular career. He was known as a brilliant, witty, somewhat cynical man about town. But then he makes a decision that changes his life forever. He falls in love with Anne More, who is the niece of his employer's wife and the daughter of a powerful parliamentarian. And he marries her in secret.
Which, in the 17th century, is not a romantic comedy trope. It's career suicide.
It was catastrophic. When Anne's father discovered the marriage, he was apoplectic. He had Donne thrown into Fleet Prison. Donne was immediately dismissed from his position with Egerton. And even after he was released from prison, he was completely blacklisted. This brilliant rising star was plunged into years of severe poverty, living in cramped houses overflowing with children, completely isolated from the court life he thrived on.
There's that famous, heartbreaking letter he reportedly wrote to his wife during this time. Just a few words. John Donne and Donne undone.
It showcases his trademark wit, but weaponized against his own tragedy. He spent years in this wilderness begging for secular employment to no avail. But eventually, King James I recognized Donne's staggering theological brilliance. The king essentially told him, "I will not employ you in the government, but if you take holy orders, I will elevate you in the church."
So, after years of resistance, Donne relents, gets ordained, and eventually becomes the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He swings from being a rogue, sensual, ambitious courtier to being the most famous, somber, deeply introspective preacher in England.
And that profound duality, the sensual lover and the agonizing sinner, the ambitious politician and the isolated outcast, completely fuels his poetry. He is a man who knows what it means to have reality shatter, and his first act of literary rebellion was against the love poetry of the era. The materials call it his anti-Petrarchan rebellion.
Let's explain what that means, because Petrarchan is one of those terms that gets thrown around in English classes. Before Donne, the standard love poetry was modeled on Petrarch, popularized in England by people like Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney. It's what they call the sugared sonnets.
Yes. In a Petrarchan poem, the roles are incredibly rigid. The woman is an idealized, flawless deity. She is the impossible she. She is pure, chaste, and usually quite cruel in her indifference. The male lover, on the other hand, is a weeping, sighing, desperate wreck who just grovels and worships her from afar. It is a highly stylized, artificial game.
And Donne looked at that and said, this is garbage. This isn't how humans actually operate.
Donne despised the convention because he felt it was fundamentally dishonest. Donne knew that human psychology is messy. A real relationship isn't just pure, unalloyed adoration. When you love someone, it is a volatile cocktail of adoration, yes, but also scorn, fear, jealousy, and crucially intense physical lust. Donne wanted to write poetry that devoured all of human experience, from the sublime spiritual heights to the repulsive, sweaty physical reality.
But this aggressively realistic, jagged style really rubs some people the wrong way. I was looking through the notes and I see that the famous 18th century critic, Dr. Samuel Johnson, absolutely hated Donne and the Metaphysicals. He accused them of yoking heterogeneous ideas by violence together, meaning forcing totally unrelated things into a metaphor just to look smart. So my question is Donne just flexing his massive vocabulary? Is he just showing off, or is there a genuine mechanism to his madness?
It's a vital question. Samuel Johnson was a product of the Augustan age. He valued that smooth, rational, heroic couplet style we discussed earlier. To Johnson, Donne's imagery seemed harsh, unnatural, and violently forced. But modern critics, spearheaded by people like T.S. Eliot in the 1920s, have vehemently defended Donne. They argue that the method to the madness is the mechanism of the conceit.
The conceit, the foundational tool of metaphysical poetry. Let's break down exactly how it works.
A conceit is essentially an extended, highly ingenious comparison between two vastly different things. But unlike a mannerist poet who just does it for a quick laugh, Donne uses a strict, almost terrifyingly rigorous legalistic logic to force you to see the connection. He takes two things that seem totally incongruous, like two lovers and a pair of drafting compasses, and he uses the intense pressure of his artistic argument to forge a profound unity out of them.
He's proving a thesis.
Exactly. He is proving that the complex emotional reality of human love can be perfectly described using the cold, technical language of alchemy, cosmology, law, or geometry. He is pulling the shattered pieces of the 17th century world science and religion and romance and gluing them back together through sheer intellectual willpower.
And it wasn't just his imagery that was jarring, it was the actual sound of his poetry, his versification. Ben Jonson, the Cavalier hero, famously said that Donne deserved hanging for not keeping of accent, meaning he kept breaking the meter.
Donne purposefully broke the smooth musical meter of the Elizabethans. If you read a Spenser poem, it sounds like a lute song, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But Donne wasn't interested in writing songs. He wanted to capture the harsh, dramatic, conversational rhythm of a real speaking voice.
He wanted to sound like a guy arguing in a tavern or a lover whispering fiercely in a bedroom.
Precisely. When you read Donne, you hear a person actively thinking, arguing, and reacting in real time. To achieve this, he relies heavily on a technique called enjambment.
Enjambment is when a sentence or a thought doesn't stop at the end of the poetic line, but bleeds over into the next line, right?
Yes, it creates a breathless, rushing momentum. He uses pauses in the middle of lines, varying line lengths, and that aggressive enjambment to map the exact erratic fluctuations of human emotion. He is charting the electrical impulses of the brain on the page.
It's like he invented the poetic equivalent of a documentary, Shanky Camp style. It's raw, unedited, and immediate. So to really grasp this, we need to get out of the theory and get into the actual lines. We need to see how Donne's mind works on the page. Let's dive inside his masterpieces, starting with his secular love poems. The subcategory here is The Seduction and the Spider.
Let's begin with one of his most famous early poems, The Flea. This is the ultimate example of his audacious, almost shocking wit applied to the art of seduction.
The premise of this poem is so outrageous. The speaker is in a room with a woman he is trying to seduce, but she is resisting. Suddenly, a literal flea jumps on him, bites him, and then jumps onto her and bites her. And Donne uses this bug as his entire argument for why they should sleep together.
He points to the flea and essentially says, "Look at this creature. It has bitten me, and now it has bitten you. Our blood is already mingled inside the stomach of this bug." He elevates this disgusting common parasite, which in the 17th century was a vector for plague and a sign of poor hygiene, into a sacred religious symbol. He tells her, "This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is."
He argues they are already fundamentally united, so yielding to him physically is no big deal. It's a spectacular, ridiculous, logical leap. But the woman isn't buying it. In the second stanza, she raises her hand to squash the flea.
And Donne pivots instantly. He begs her to stop, using the heaviest religious language possible. He says that if she kills the flea, she will be committing murder by killing him, suicide by killing herself, and sacrilege by destroying the sacred temple of their union. He is using Catholic theology to save a bug to win an argument about sex.
But she doesn't care. She squashes it anyway. The poem says she purples her nail in blood of innocence, and she gloats. She says, "Look, the bug is dead, and neither of us is any weaker or sicker for having killed it. Your argument was stupid."
But this is where Donne's brilliance as an argumentative lawyer shines. He doesn't miss a beat. He instantly absorbs her action and flips it into a new syllogism, a logical argument. He says, "Exactly, you are completely right. Just as you lost no honor or life when you squashed the flea, you will lose absolutely no honor by yielding to me physically." It is a completely harmless exchange. He corners her intellectually. It is dramatic, intimate, and incredibly manipulative.
It's a masterclass in rhetorical judo. But as funny and clever as the flea is, Donne had a very dark side. And we see that perfectly in Twickenham Garden, which explores the bitter reality of a betrayed lover.
In Twickenham Garden, the speaker is devastated by unrequited love. He comes to a beautiful, lush spring garden, hoping the beauty of nature will comfort his broken heart. But his psychological state is so toxic that his mere presence corrupts the physical space.
He brings this terrifying concept, spider love. He says his spider love transubstantiates all, converting the sweet manna of the garden into bitter gall.
Let's look at the density of the vocabulary there. Transubstantiates, that is a massive, incredibly loaded theological word. It is the Catholic doctrine where the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ. It's a miracle of divine love. But Donne inverts it. He uses this holy mechanism to describe the toxic, ruining, poisonous effect of his own bitterness. He takes the manna, the heavenly food God gave the Israelites, and turns it into gall, poison. He turns himself into the serpent entering the Garden of Eden.
He takes all the weight of centuries of biblical history and uses it to explain how bad his breakup feels. That is the definition of a conceit.
And what's crucial to notice here is the psychological detachment. Even in the very depths of despair, Donne's speaker does not just weep like a Petrarchan lover. He analyzes his own misery with cold, clinical precision. He is fascinated by how his own mind can twist reality, making a hell out of heaven.
Okay, but Donne isn't all just sleazy seduction and bitter breakups. When he actually maps out true mutual love, it is stunning. Let's move to the metaphysic of true love and look at The Good Morrow.
The Good Morrow is a breathtaking poem about spiritual and physical awakening. The speaker looks at his lover in bed and asks a genuine question. I wonder, by my troth, what thou and I did till we loved. He concludes that before they found each other, they were just infants, weaned on country pleasures, childishly. Every romance they had before this was just a dim dream of this current, blinding reality.
They wake up into a perfect union. And to describe how perfect it is, he uses geography and exploration. The 17th century is the age of discovery, right? Ships sailing off the edge of the map. Donne says, let the sea discoverers go find new worlds. We have our own complete world right here in this little room.
He creates an entire cosmology out of their intimacy. He describes the two lovers as two hemispheres making up one perfect entire globe. And he pulls from 17th century alchemy. In alchemy, it was believed that things only decay and die because they are improperly mixed. But if a substance is perfectly mixed, perfectly proportioned, it is immortal. Donne asserts whatever dies was not mixed equally. Therefore, because their love is perfectly balanced, it is immune to dissolution. It cannot die.
That is such a beautiful fusion of science and emotion. But he doesn't ignore the physical body in favor of pure intellect. And that brings us to The Ecstasy, which is arguably his most philosophical poem.
The Ecstasy tackles the age-old philosophical debate. How do the physical body and the immortal soul interact? The poem opens with a very quiet, intense scene. The lovers are sitting on a grassy bank, holding hands, gazing intensely into each other's eyes. The physical bodies are completely still, but their souls actually leave their bodies and hang in the air between them.
Like a spiritual negotiation happening outside the physical realm.
Exactly. The souls mingle and intertwine, forging a new, single, perfect soul that is greater than the sum of its parts. It is the ultimate Platonic ideal of love, pure spirit, completely disconnected from the messy physical world.
But they don't stay there. That's the twist.
That is the crucial turn in the poem. The souls realize that they cannot remain suspended in the air forever. They must return to their physical bodies. Donne is mounting a profound defense of physical intimacy. He argues that the body is not the enemy of the soul, nor is it a dirty, sinful thing. The body is the necessary vehicle. As he writes, the body is the book that allows the soul to be read and understood by others. Spiritual love must be consummated physically for the union to be fully realized.
Love's mysteries and souls do grow, but yet the body is his book. It validates human physical connection as a divine act. And this leads us to the ultimate, most famous conceits of his career, the canonization and a valediction, forbidding mourning.
The canonization is an aggressive defense of love against the cynical, practical, materialist world. The poem opens with a burst of irritation. A bystander has been criticizing him for wasting his time on love instead of getting a job or making money. Donne snaps back, for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love.
He essentially tells the guy, go get a job, go worship the king on his throne, or worship the king's face stamped on a gold coin. Leave me alone.
He doesn't care about courtly ambition. He then builds a conceit comparing his love to the mythic phoenix. The phoenix burns itself to ashes and resurrects from its own fire. Donne says he and his lover die and rise the same, proving mysterious by their love. They are so incredibly devoted that future generations will recognize them as martyrs and saints of love. They will be canonized. Their love letters will become holy hymns.
It's incredibly arrogant, but he earns it by the end of the poem. And then we have a valediction, forbidding mourning. This is a love that has matured beyond the need for constant physical proximity. He wrote this when he had to leave his wife for a diplomatic trip to France.
He tells his wife not to mourn his departure with tear floods or sigh tempests. Those are the shallow, noisy reactions of ordinary lovers whose love is entirely dependent on physical touch. He argues that their souls are so perfectly forged together that physical distance doesn't create a breach, a break, but an expansion, like a piece of precious gold being beaten with a hammer until it stretches to an airy thinness.
And then comes the grand finale of metaphysical conceits, the compass metaphor.
It is a stunning feat of logic. He is trying to explain how two souls can be one, yet inhabit two different bodies that are moving apart. He says, if our souls are two, they are two like the stiff legs of a drafting compass, the tool used in geometry to draw a perfect circle.
I love how he uses a cold metal mathematical instrument to explain deep emotional devotion.
It grounds the abstract emotion in undeniable physical reality. He tells his wife that she is the fixed foot in the center. She sits securely in the middle of the paper. But as he, the roaming foot, travels outward and traces a circle around her, the center foot leans and hearkens after him. It feels the tension of his journey. And crucially, it is her absolute firmness and loyalty in the center that makes his circle perfect and ensures that he will eventually close the loop and return to where he started.
It perfectly fuses mathematics, geometry, and unbreakable emotional fidelity. It is brilliant. But as we know, Donne's life changed drastically when he became a priest. And we can't leave Donne without talking about his struggle with God, the divine poems. Because when he put on the collar, he didn't suddenly become a quiet, submissive saint. He aimed that exact same intense, argumentative, lawyerly intellect directly at the Almighty.
The divine poems are incredibly dramatic. Donne treats his relationship with God with the same psychological complexity and turbulence that he applied to his human lovers. He doesn't just humbly submit, he wrestles with God. Look at Holy Sonnet 14, batter my heart, three-personed God.
The opening line alone is a violent demand. He is demanding that God forcefully take him over.
Because he feels that gentle requests aren't working. He compares himself to an usurped town. He is a fortress that rightfully belongs to God, but he is currently occupied by the enemy, which is sin and worldly temptation. He says that reason, which is supposed to be God's viceroy in his mind, has been captured and is failing to defend him.
So he needs a divine rescue mission. But the imagery he uses is so shockingly violent.
He uses the imagery of a blacksmith working with heavy metal. He tells God that merely knocking, breathing, and shining on him isn't enough. God must break, blow, burn, and make me new. He wants to be hammered on the anvil of grace.
And then he brings in the erotic marital imagery, which is wild to read in a holy sonnet. He begs God to divorce him from his worldly seducer. He says, "Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me."
Ravish is a violently sexual word. Donne is establishing a profound paradox. True spiritual freedom can only come from complete divine imprisonment, and true spiritual purity can only be achieved through complete, overwhelming divine subjugation. He is begging God to conquer his rebellious intellect.
And we see that struggle right up to the end of his life. His hymn to God the Father was written when he was severely ill and legitimately thought he was going to die. It's a bit calmer than Batter My Heart, but it is still packed with his trademark wit and intellectual games.
It revolves around a brilliant, agonizing pun on his own last name, Donne, and the word done, as in finished, and also a pun on the sun in the sky and the Son of God, Jesus Christ. He is listing his multitude of sins to God and constantly repeating the anxious refrain, "When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more."
He is terrified that his sins are so massive they will exhaust God's forgiveness. He confesses to his sin of fear. He is terrified that when he has spun his last thread of life, he will perish on the shore of eternity, abandoned.
But the poem resolves this profound, very human terror. He asks God to swear that at the moment of his death, God's sun will shine upon him as he shines now. Having secured that logical promise of grace, Donne ends with overwhelming, uncharacteristic serenity. And having done that, thou hast done, I fear no more. His relentless questioning reason finally surrenders to faith.
Incredible. So that's Donne, the argumentative lawyer wrestling with love in the bedroom and wrestling with God in the pulpit. Now we're going to pivot to the second member of our metaphysical big three. And on the surface, this guy seems like the complete opposite of Donne, George Herbert. If Donne is the prodigal son fighting every step of the way, Herbert is the one quietly, humbly building the house.
George Herbert's trajectory is fascinating because he actively walked away from the very things Donne spent half his life begging for. Herbert was born into a powerful aristocratic family. He was highly educated and became the public orator at Cambridge University. He was rubbing shoulders with the elite, on the absolute fast track to a major political career at court.
He had it all.
And he gave all of it up. He abandoned his political ambitions to become a humble, rural country parson at a tiny parish in Bemerton. He spent the rest of his life tending to the spiritual needs of poor farmers. After his death, his collection of poetry, titled The Temple, was published, and it meticulously maps the intricate progress of the human soul seeking God.
Okay, I have to stop here and offer some genuine pushback. I'm looking at these notes and I'm struggling to see the connection. Donne is writing these hyper-complex, aggressive, arrogant philosophical puzzles about fleas and compasses. Herbert is writing sweet, simple, humble country parson poetry. Why are literary historians grouping them together in the same metaphysical category? It feels like we were just lumping them together because they lived at the same time. What am I missing?
That is exactly the reaction Herbert wants you to have, and it is exactly why he is so brilliant. Herbert is grouped with Donne because Herbert possessed the exact same staggering intellectual tools as Donne, the capacity for massive conceits, deep philosophical logic, and dense wordplay. The difference is that Herbert's simplicity is terrifyingly deliberate. It is a highly crafted, conscious rejection of the ego-driven, flamboyant poetry of his peers.
So he could write like Donne, but he chose not to.
Precisely. Donne leaves the scaffolding on the building so you can admire how smart the architect is. Herbert hides the scaffolding so you only admire the building, which is God. In his poem, Jordan's II, Herbert explicitly tackles this artistic crisis. He talks about how, when he first started writing heavenly poetry, he sought out quaint words and trim invention. He admits he was curling with metaphors of plain intention.
He was trying to dress up his devotion with flashy intellect, trying to show off to God.
Yes, he was exhausted by the effort of trying to be clever. But then in the poem, he hears a friend whisper to him, and that friend is the voice of God. God whispers, "How wide is all this long pretense? There is in love a sweetness ready penned. Copy out only that and save expense."
Wow. God is basically saying, stop trying so hard. The truth is already perfect. Just copy it down.
Herbert realizes that true devotion requires stripping away the poet's massive ego. The true complexity of his poetry lies in the agonizing discipline required to find the exact, perfect, unadorned word to express the divine without letting his own pride get in the way.
And his mastery of form is just mind-blowing. Let's look at his use of shaped poetry, or concrete poetry, where the physical layout of the text on the page actually mirrors the theme of the poem. Easter wings is the classic example here.
If you look at Easter wings printed on the page, the lines physically form the shape of two birds' wings resting on their sides. But it is not just a cheap visual gimmick, it is a profound mapping of theology. The lines shrink in length as he describes humanity's fall from grace. He talks about how God created man with wealth and store, but man foolishly lost it all, decaying more and more. And as the spiritual decay happens, the physical lines of the poem get shorter and shorter, down to the absolute skinniest lines in the middle, most poor and most thin.
The text literally starves on the page. And then, as he asks to rise with Christ on Easter, he says, "With thee, let me combine." And the lines start expanding back out, getting longer and longer, mirroring spiritual flight and the spreading of wings. The visual form and the spiritual meaning are completely, inextricably fused.
We also see his brilliant, subtle use of the conceit and the pulley. The poem envisions God standing in his workshop at the exact moment of human creation, holding a glass filled with all the world's blessings. God pours out strength, beauty, wisdom, honor, and pleasure upon humanity.
But he doesn't pour everything. God stops and keeps one single thing remaining in the bottom of the glass: peace or rest.
God reasons that if he bestows rest on humanity, humans will become completely self-sufficient. They will adore the gifts instead of the God who gave them. They will rest in nature, not the God of nature.
So God deliberately withholds peace. He ensures that humanity will always be fundamentally restless, weary, and tossed about by the trials of life.
Exactly. And that weariness acts as a mechanical pulley. A pulley uses tension to lift heavy weight. God uses a tension of human exhaustion to eventually draw humanity back up to the divine breast. It is a stunning metaphysical conceit, a mechanical workshop tool used to perfectly explain the fundamental human condition of perpetual dissatisfaction.
It is so incredibly elegant. But I know Herbert wasn't always just peacefully submitting. He wasn't immune to the chaos of the century. He has moments of intense, explosive rebellion, and the best example is The Caller.
The Caller is a masterpiece of dramatic tension. The title refers to the clerical collar of a priest, but also the collar of a prisoner or a beast of burden. The speaker is utterly furious about the constraints of his faith. He feels caged by religious discipline. He beats his hands on the table and cries out, "No more I will abroad." He complains bitterly about losing the secular joys of life, the wine and the corn, feeling that he has wasted his life serving a demanding master.
And the structure of the poem completely reflects that chaos. Unlike Easter Wings, the rhyme scheme here is entirely unpredictable. The meter is jagged, irregular, and chaotic. Reading it feels like watching someone throw a tantrum, pacing around a room, shouting and knocking over chairs.
He rants and raves, working himself into an absolute frenzy of rebellion. He tells himself to tie up his fears and break out of his cage. But then comes the final 4 lines. Right at the absolute peak of his rebellious fury, the poem instantly resolves. The jagged rhythm suddenly snaps into perfect, harmonious, alternating rhyme, he writes. But as I raved and grew more fierce and wild at every word, methought I heard one calling, "Child," and I replied, "My lord."
Boom, it gives me chills every time I read it. One single word from God, child, and the massive ego completely collapses. The rebellion evaporates instantly. The form of the poem snaps back into perfect order. It is the ultimate expression of the prodigal son returning home.
Herbert uses his incredible technical virtuosity not to show off his own intellect, but to vividly dramatize the surrender of the human will to divine grace.
Okay, we have gone from the loud, argumentative lawyer in London to the quiet, brilliant parson in the countryside. Now we move to our final metaphysical master, a man who didn't have the luxury of retreating from the world because he had to navigate the incredibly dangerous, literal political waters of the English Civil War. The skeptic in the garden, Andrew Marvell.
Marvell is a deeply fascinating, slippery figure. He was an active politician, a member of Parliament, and a man who managed to survive living through the bloody execution of King Charles I, the rise of Oliver Cromwell's Republic, and the eventual restoration of the monarchy. His poetry is a bridge. It blends the dazzling intellectual wit of the Metaphysicals with the coming classical poise, balance, and rationality of the Augustans. He is the ultimate observer, weighing different perspectives without losing his balance.
Let's start with his most famous poem, which is a staple in every literature class, To His Coy Mistress. We talked about Robert Herrick's Carpe Diem earlier, gathering rosebuds gently before you get old. Marvell takes that theme, injects it with metaphysical wit, and applies a terrifying sense of urgency and ruthless logic to it.
The poem is structured not just as a lyric, but as a strict philosophical syllogism in 3 parts. If, but therefore.
Let's walk through it. First, the if. He tells his mistress, "Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime." He says if they had all of eternity, he wouldn't mind waiting. He would spend 100 years praising her eyes, 200 years adoring each breast, and 30,000 years praising the rest of her. He says his vegetable love would grow vaster than empires.
It is a hilarious, exaggerated mockery of those slow, endless Petrarchan courtships. He's saying, yes, in a theoretical universe where we are immortal, playing hard to get is fine. But then comes the second stanza.
Yeah.
The crushing reality check. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near.
It is an incredibly arresting image. Time is no longer a gentle fading of a rose. It is a predator in a chariot running you down, and what lies ahead of the chariot. Not a peaceful afterlife, but deserts of vast eternity.
He strips away all religious comfort. He gets brutally realistic about the physical decay of the body. He tells her that in her marble vault, her beauty will be gone. His echoing songs of praise won't be heard in the tomb. And then he delivers one of the most devastating, grotesque lines in English poetry. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity.
It is a shocking intrusion of reality. You don't expect to hear about flesh-eating worms in a seduction poem.
It completely undercuts the sentimental evasions of other Carpe Diem poems. He says, "The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace." He uses the biblical echoes of dust and ashes, not for moral instruction, but to highlight the absolute, terrifying finality of biological death.
So that horrifying reality leads directly to the therefore. Because we are going to die and worms are going to eat us, we must act right now. But he doesn't say, let's gently hold hands. He says, let us act like amorous birds of prey.
He urges her to join him in a violent, desperate consummation. They must devour their time. They must roll all their strength and sweetness into one concentrated ball and physically tear their pleasures with rough strife, thorough the iron gates of life. It is an unsentimental, almost brutal realism. Marvell is saying that we cannot stop the sun from setting, we cannot stop time, but we can make it run by burning so fiercely that we beat time at its own game.
It is a phenomenal argument. It's a far cry from the gentle Spenserians. Now, Marvell also wrote poetry that seems to completely contradict that aggressive libertine energy. Let's look at his poem, The Garden.
The garden represents the other side of Marvell's psyche. It is what we might call an anti-libertine poem. He explores the genre of the solitary, meditative retreat. The speaker retreats into a lush, perfectly enclosed garden, deliberately escaping the busy, ambitious, violent world of society and escaping the exhausting pursuit of women.
He actually rejects female beauty explicitly here. He says the white and red of women's cheeks are far less amorous than the lovely green of nature. He even makes a witty joke about classical mythology. He says that when the gods chased nymphs, like Apollo chasing Daphne, they didn't actually want to catch the woman. They were just running after her so she would turn into a tree.
It's a brilliant, witty subversion of mythology to praise the superiority of plant life over human romance. But the true core of the poem is about the supreme power of the human mind. As he rests physically in the garden, his mind begins to withdraw from the physical pleasures of the senses. He describes the mind creating its own internal worlds, transcending the physical reality entirely.
This leads to the most famous lines in the poem, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. That feels like the ultimate metaphysical concept.
It truly is. The entire physical world, everything that has ever been made, just dissolves into pure conceptual thought. It is the ecstasy of the isolated intellect. The soul detaches from the physical body, casting aside its shoe, and prepares for heavenly flight. Marvell suggests that this solitary contemplation, completely free from the passions of human love and political ambition, is the closest humanity can ever get to recreating the lost innocence of the Garden of Eden.
Okay, we have to look at Marvell's political poetry, because you can't live through the English Civil War without writing about it. But before we dive into an Horatian ode, I want to frame this for our listeners. Looking at this source material, what fascinates me is how objectively we have to look at this today. We aren't here to take sides between the royalists and parliamentarians. The tragedy and the triumph of both sides are deeply embedded in history. We are not endorsing any side here. The fascinating part of this poem is watching how Marvell himself refuses to take a clean side. He walks this incredible, dangerous tightrope between the two factions.
That is the perfect way to approach it. An Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland is universally considered a masterpiece of political impartiality and complex balancing. It was written in 1650. The context is crucial. King Charles I has recently been publicly beheaded. Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentarian general, has seized power and is returning from a brutal military campaign in Ireland.
And what's amazing is that critics literally still argue to this day about whether Marvell was a secret royalist or a devout parliamentarian when he wrote this, because the poem praises both men so highly while acknowledging their terrible flaws.
Let's look at how he handles Cromwell. Marvell depicts Cromwell not necessarily as a righteous saint, but as an unstoppable elemental force of nature. He compares Cromwell to three-forked lightning breaking violently through a cloud. He says Cromwell possesses industrious valor and sad valor. He's the supreme man of action, the man of destiny, driven by a historical power far above himself. Marvell clearly respects Cromwell's ruthless efficiency and his fitness for the highest trust in the state. He is building a new republic.
But at the exact same time, in the very same poem, Marvell writes one of the most beautiful, dignified tributes to the executed King Charles III that has ever been written. He describes the king walking out onto the execution scaffold.
He describes Charles as a royal actor who adorned the tragic scaffold. Marvell writes that Charles did not call upon the gods with vulgar spite, nor did he beg for his life. Instead, with supreme grace, he bowed his comely head down to the executioner's block as upon a bed. Marvell captures the absolute dignity, the divine right, and the passive, noble suffering of the king.
So he forces the reader to hold these two opposing images. Cromwell, the unstoppable force of active power and unnecessary violence, destroying the old world. And Charles, the beautiful tragic grace of the old world being destroyed.
Exactly. Marvell admires the new civic Roman ideal of the republic that Cromwell is building with his sword, but he is unflinchingly realistic about the fact that it is a forced power. He acknowledges the bloody foundation of the republic, the execution of God's anointed king, without necessarily condemning the political necessity of it. It's an incredible feat of intellectual gymnastics, holding two totally opposing truths in his mind at once without resolving them into cheap propaganda.
It's the ultimate metaphysical balancing act applied to the trauma of politics.
Oh.
Which brings us to our grand synthesis. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. If you were sitting down to study the 17th century poetry landscape, how do you pull all these threads together?
You must frame it primarily as a fractured world. The 17th century was the earthquake. The fundamental foundations of religion, science, cosmology, and politics were shattering simultaneously. Every writer had to find a coping mechanism. The Spenserians tried to ignore the chaos and preserve the pastoral past. The Cavaliers tried to laugh, drink, and love their way through it, clinging to classical grace as their world burned. The Augustans tried to regulate and contain the chaos with strict meter, reason, and scientific plainness.
But the metaphysicals, John Donne, George Herbert, and Andrew Marvell, did something different. They stared directly into the chaos, they didn't flinch, they didn't hide, and they didn't pretend it wasn't happening. They used their extreme intellect, their bizarre, extended analogies, and their massive conceits to forcefully fuse the broken pieces of science, religion, and human emotion back together.
They proved that even in a fundamentally broken world, if you push the human intellect hard enough, you can find a profound, if highly complex, new unity. They accurately mapped the messy, contradictory reality of the modern human mind and soul.
They really did. And that brings us to the end of our exploration today. But before we go, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over as you go about your day.
We saw how the metaphysical poets used the absolute cutting-edge science and technology of their 17th century day-drafting compasses, Copernican astronomy, telescopes, alchemy, to explain the deepest, most timeless mysteries of human emotion and the soul.
So imagine if John Donne were alive right now, sitting at a desk with a laptop, looking at the science of the 21st century. What technological or scientific concept would he use to build a conceit today? Would he use the hidden, opaque neural networks of artificial intelligence to explain how we can't truly know our lover's mind?
Or would he use quantum entanglement, where two particles affect each other instantly across vast, impossible distances in space, as a conceit for long-distance love and fidelity?
Or maybe the event horizon of a black hole, where time physically stops, to describe the inescapable, crushing pull of divine grace?
How would the master of the conceit explain the terrifying complexities of modern love using the science of right now?
Something to think about. Until next time.